On a quiet Monday morning, the Garrington Bank lobby hummed with the usual rhythm of business, clicking heels, murmured greetings, and the faint tapping of keyboards behind polished desks. Among the early arrivals sat a well-dressed black woman in a deep emerald hat, her presence elegant but unassuming. She entered without fanfare, took a seat, and waited for a meeting that no one seemed in a hurry to honor. Employees passed her without a second glance. Clients were greeted ahead of her, even those who arrived much later. Behind the glass door, the bank manager, Martin Bell, moved from desk to desk, shaking hands, pouring coffee, laughing, never once acknowledging the woman waiting quietly by the window. It appeared to be just another day at the bank. But what none of them realized was that the woman they ignored had already changed the future of Garrington Bank forever, and while Martin Bell thought he was exercising his authority, he was, in truth, writing the first line of his own undoing. And so began the moment when the bank manager made the black woman wait 2 long hours, with no idea who she truly was. The woman in the green hat enters. It was exactly 9:45 a.m. when the glass doors of Garrington Bank hissed open. The morning sun, cruel and unfiltered, bounced off their polished surface as if trying to warn the world something unusual was about to happen. In stepped a woman, tall, graceful, composed. Her skin was the rich brown of coffee brewed strong, her posture regal without arrogance. She wore a forest green hat, wide, brimmed and slightly tilted, with a netted veil that danced faintly in the air-conditioned breeze. Her coat was simple, pressed, and elegant. A faded leather purse hung from her wrist like an old friend. She walked with a sense of calm that didn't demand attention. It commanded it. Heads turned, though none would admit it. She made her way to the reception desk, heels echoing softly against the marble floor. Behind the counter, a young woman greeted her with that artificial warmth bank staff reserve for people they think don't matter. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman's voice was low, smooth, precise. "I need to speak with the branch manager. It's a private matter." No raised tone, no smile, just a quiet gravity that made her sound less like a customer and more like a chapter waiting to be read. The receptionist blinked, paused, then nodded. "Of course, one moment." She typed something, too casually, and buzzed the office beyond. In that moment, everyone went back to their business, but no one really stopped watching her. She didn't sit yet. She stood by the counter, her eyes scanning the golden, framed certificates on the walls, the potted plants that had seen too many Mondays, and the security guard pretending not to stare. The manager didn't come out, but that's when he entered the story. Dismissed at a glance, Martin Bell was everything you'd expect from a man who measured his importance by the weight of his wristwatch. Mid-30s, overconfident, with a designer tie and an undercurrent of arrogance that filled every inch of the office long before he opened his mouth. When he stepped out of his glass, walled office and saw her standing there, he didn't see the green hat. He didn't see the composed posture. What he saw was his own assumption. He walked over not briskly, not lazily, but with the kind of pace that said, "I'm only doing this because I'm curious why she's still standing." His lips parted into a polite, but firm smile, the kind that says no. Before the words even come, "Good morning, you asked to see me," the woman turned, slow and steady, her gaze locking with his. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. "Yes, I have a private banking matter I'd like to discuss directly." Martin didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask her name. Instead, he gave her the look, the one that weighs you, judges you, files you under not worth the time. "Do you have an appointment?" A no. He smiled wider, but it was thinner now, as if forced through gritted teeth. "Unfortunately, we're very busy today. You'll have to wait." With that, he motioned casually toward the waiting chairs, the ones nearest the window where the sun would be cruelest by noon. She nodded once, without a word, and made her way to the seat. She sat like a queen on a throne of plastic and chrome, her dignity untouched by the temperature of the room, or the temperature of the man who had just dismissed her. Martin turned away, confident he had just handled another minor disruption. Little did he know, the next few hours would undo everything he thought he knew about power, respect, and who really runs the world. The 2-hour wait the woman sat, still, silent, unbothered on the surface, but beneath that veil her eyes moved like clock hands, patient, precise, watching everything. one leg crossed neatly over the other, gloved hands resting atop her purse. She looked like someone waiting for a performance to begin, not a service to be granted. Minutes dragged, the bank ticked on, the receptionist glanced her way occasionally, uneasy. Customers arrived, some loud, some chatty, some familiar. Most were white, dressed in pastel blouses and linen pants, their shoes squeaking cheerfully across the marble floor. They were greeted with warmth, welcomed with smiles, and most of all seen, one man wearing a gold watch and smelling like aftershave and ego walked in and said, "Need to speak to Martin." He was ushered in within 5 minutes. An elderly couple came in for loan paperwork. 10 minutes, they were offered coffee. A young entrepreneur needed to discuss expanding his business account. Straight to the office, Martin shook his hand like they were old friends. And all the while, she waited, no complaint, no question, no shifting in her seat. The room felt the weight of her silence more than they would have felt outrage. By the time the bank's grandfather clock struck 11:45, a full 2 hours had passed. The woman hadn't moved, but every tick of that clock had shaved something off Martin's image in the eyes of the staff. Even the receptionist, once dismissive, now looked uncomfortable, stealing nervous glances at her manager's door. But the woman, she remained composed, like someone who'd long ago mastered the art of being underestimated. Others are prioritized and welcomed. The double doors to Martin's office opened and closed like stage curtains, again and again, but never for her. He had smiled for others, broadly, had offered them seats inside, sometimes laughter. At one point, he even stepped out personally to greet a client at the door, hand extended before the man had said a word. But not once did he look toward the woman in the green hat. It wasn't just neglect, it was a performance, a quiet, consistent act of erasure. Each person who entered after her and was served before her became part of the pattern. Even the security guard started noticing. He tapped his pen against his notepad rhythmically, eyes flicking between Martin's office and the woman by the window. She had come in earlier than all of them. Spoken less than all of them, yet had waited longer than anyone should, and Martin, he was coasting, riding the high of authority like it was oxygen. To him, she was invisible, probably some inheritance confusion. He had said earlier under his breath to a colleague, "Or a complaint about interest rates, you know how they get." That one word cracked through the silence like a whisper in a confession booth, and yet the woman gave no reaction. She watched, listened. Every favor Martin granted someone else, every apology he didn't give her, every smile that skipped her direction like she wasn't worth its muscles. The irony, of course, was that Martin believed he was winning, believed he was maintaining order, keeping the right people happy, and quietly pushing the wrong ones to the margins. He thought he knew exactly who mattered. He didn't know he was walking into a moment that would be etched in his career's obituary. Because what he hadn't noticed, what none of them had, was the black town car slowly pulling up outside the glass doors. Inside were 5 board members, and they weren't there for a meeting, they were there for her. The quiet storm, still she waited. Her posture never sagged, her eyes never wandered pointlessly. She sat like a statue carved from common, moving but unmistakably present. Even the way she breathed felt measured, like each inhale was timed and each exhale knew a secret. The purse on her lap stayed closed, but you got the feeling that if she opened it, the truth would come pouring out like a tidal wave. No phone, no watch checking, no restless leg shaking. This woman had the patience of someone who had waited her whole life, not just for service in a bank, but for people to finally see her. The air in the bank had shifted, subtle but there. A few customers stole glances at her and then at the staff, as if silently asking, "Has no one helped her yet?" But no one said a word. That's how systems work. Quiet bias loudly ignored. The receptionist grew red in the cheeks each time she looked over. The security guard now lingered closer to her end of the room, almost protectively, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was instinct, or maybe, just maybe, he could feel the storm she carried just beneath that veil. Because storms don't always start with thunder. Sometimes they sit, they wait. They gather until it's time, and she was waiting for that time. When the doors opened at exactly 12:03 p.m., the bank doors opened with an audible click and a gust of cooled outside air. 5 figures entered, 3 men, 2 women, all dressed with an understated elegance that screamed old money without saying a word. Their suits were tailored, their shoes untouched by dust, their silence louder than any greeting. Martin Bell saw them instantly. He jumped up so fast he nearly tripped over his own polished leather shoes. "Mr. Langford, MS Hanley, we weren't expecting you today." But they weren't listening. Their eyes were scanning the room, searching for someone. Not him, not anyone he considered important, and then they saw her. There was a pause, the kind that pulls the breath from a room and snaps it in half. The older man in the center, Langford, chairman of the board, broke into a grin not even age could tame. He moved fast for a man in his 70s, heading straight toward the woman in the green hat. "Margaret," he said, voice warm, full of something close to awe, "you came early." Every set of eyes in the lobby turned. The silence was now deafening. "Margaret, yes." Margaret stood, gracefully, powerfully, as if the chair had never held her, only waited to release her. "I thought I'd observe the atmosphere before we began." The others from the board followed. They shook her hand, they smiled like she was a queen returning home, and then came the words that detonated every assumption Martin Bell had built like sandcastles around himself. "Everyone, this is Margaret Dupree, our new majority shareholder." Time fractured. Reality cracked. Martin's face drained of color, the receptionist gasped audibly, the guard straightened like a soldier in inspection, because this wasn't just a woman with a banking request. This was a woman who had watched every second of her own mistreatment, and now stood above atoning the very place that had tried to ignore her. The green hat, now it looked like a crown, and Martin, he looked like a man who had just realized he'd been stepping on a landmine. For 2 straight hours, recognition and reverence, Martin stood frozen, caught mid-step between arrogance and shock. The board members surrounded Margaret like stars orbiting their sun. Their greetings were not casual, they were honors, full of respect, layered with history. MS Hanley, the youngest board executive, leaned in with genuine admiration. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person, MS Dupree. We've heard so much. Your rise, your investments, truly inspiring." Margaret nodded gracefully, her lips offering the faintest smile. "Thank you. I believe observation reveals more than reports ever can." The atmosphere in the bank shifted on its axis. Every customer, every employee watching. Martin's mouth opened, searching for words, but his voice had abandoned him. The woman he made wait had just turned the hierarchy upside down without raising her tone or voice. She wasn't just someone important, she was the centerpiece of power, standing where only minutes ago she had been ignored. The hidden queen revealed as the murmurs spread, more details surfaced. Margaret Dupree, it turned out, was not only the majority shareholder of Garrington Bank, but also the woman behind its recent expansion into underserved communities. Her portfolio had quietly absorbed stock, climbing silently until she owned 51% of the very institution that had asked her to wait. But what stunned everyone most wasn't just her status, it was the story beneath it. She had once cleaned floors in that same building, years ago, worn the uniform, pushed the mop. People had stepped over her then, just as Martin had dismissed her now. Her rise wasn't luck, it was strategy. Steadfastness, vision sharpened by decades of being overlooked. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you must let people show you who they are, before you decide what they're worth." The room bowed in silence. In Martin, he had never felt so small. A manager's fall from pride. Martin Bell stood paralyzed, a stiff smile frozen on his face like wax under a heat lamp. His eyes darted from board member to board member, then back to Margaret MS. Dupree, he now remembered to call her MS Dupree. He stammered, I wasn't aware." She cut him off with nothing more than a look, calm, controlled, deadly in its silence. "No, Mr. Bell, you were aware, you just didn't care." Gasps were muffled. Even the security guard dropped his gaze. Martin's polished image, his rehearsed charm, his practiced authority, crumbled with each breath. This wasn't just embarrassment, it was exposure. He had spent the morning performing for status. Now, that performance had been flipped like a broken mirror, each shard cutting into the illusion he wore so confidently. The board said nothing, they didn't need to. Their silence was approval of her, not him. Martin Bell had built his career on knowing who mattered, and now he didn't even matter in his own office. The cleaner who bought the bank the story, whispered in corners later that week, was this. Margaret Dupree had once cleaned the floors of Garrington Bank years ago, long before the renovations, before the glass walls and chrome accents. She had walked those marble tiles with a mop in her hand while others walked past her like furniture. But Margaret hadn't just cleaned. She'd observed, learned, read forgotten newspapers left on desks, studied conversations, noticed patterns, and saved. Slowly, smartly, when she left, no one noticed. Years passed, then came investments. Property, stocks, she never stopped. Every brick of her empire laid by hands once blistered by bleach and hard labor. Now she stood in the center of that same bank, not as staff, not as customer, as owner. "You thought you saw a cleaner," she said to Martin, "but I was just passing through." That moment didn't just humiliate a man, it rewrote the rules of power, respect, and perception. Margaret Dupree didn't demand a seat at the table. She bought the whole room. When Margaret Dupree finally walked out of Garrington Bank that day, she did so with her head high and the entire board behind her. Martin Bell, now pale and trembling, sat in his office with the weight of humiliation heavier than any reprimand. No one needed to raise their voice. The truth had spoken for itself. In a single morning, a woman once overlooked had reclaimed every ounce of dignity that had ever been denied to her, not with anger, but with presence. Her quiet had spoken louder than shouting ever could. Her success didn't just challenge assumptions, it shattered them. Everyone who witnessed it would remember, the receptionist, the guard, the customers. And most of all Martin Bell, because that day a woman once mistaken for invisible had reminded them all, power isn't loud. Power is knowing exactly who you are and letting the world figure it out. This speech begins where most stories of leadership and honor do, with duty. On a crisp Virginia morning, Major General Althea James set out for what should have been a routine drive to a leadership symposium. Dressed in her formal Army uniform, she was ready to share her decades of service, hard-won wisdom, and the quiet strength it takes to lead not just soldiers, but systems. It was to be a day of inspiration, reflection, and forward momentum. But the journey to that stage would become a story in itself, a collision of race, power, and dignity, a test not of strategy or combat skill, but of grace under fire in a battle she didn't expect to fight. And yet it is precisely this journey, this disruption, that makes her message all the more vital, because sometimes the mission begins before the speech ever starts. A routine drive, a distinguished journey. The sun rose gently over the Virginia skyline as Major General Althea James stepped out of her modest suburban home, her uniform crisp and precise, the weight of her medals resting proudly on her chest. The driveway gleamed under her boots as she slid into her black SUV. Today wasn't about war zones or Pentagon briefings. Today, she was set to deliver a keynote address at a leadership symposium, sharing her journey, wisdom, and hard-won insights with the next generation of military scholars. Her GPS guided her through the scenic route along Route 29, a path she'd taken countless times. Calm jazz floated from her stereo, and her mind drifted between the speech she had rehearsed and the quiet satisfaction of service well rendered. There was a serene dignity to her morning, a decorated black woman, a two-star general, simply moving through the world she had helped defend. But as she crossed the county line, the air subtly changed, like a storm waiting behind still skies. The blue flash in the rear view, it started with a shadow in the rear view mirror. A patrol car pulled out sharply from behind an old diner, hugging her bumper a little too closely. At first, Althea thought nothing of it, maybe a coincidence. She checked her speed, exactly the limit, hands on the wheel, eyes forward, but the car didn't pass. Instead, it tailed her with a strange intensity. Then came the sudden whoop of the siren and the red, blue strobe that shattered the calm morning. With the trained calmness of a seasoned officer, she pulled to the side and lowered her window. The cop approached briskly, eyes hidden behind mirrored aviators, his tone clipped and impatient. License and registration, he snapped before even greeting her. Althea handed them over, including her military ID. He barely looked. You in a rush or just can't drive straight? He said, dismissing her explanation. She remained polite, but he wasn't listening. His next words chilled her. Step out of the vehicle. In that moment, something shifted. This wasn't a routine stop. It was something else, something darker. Stripped of rank, met with disdain, Althea James had faced enemy fire, negotiated hostage releases, and led battalions through hostile zones. But nothing prepared her for the quiet insult of being ignored on her own soil. The officer didn't flinch when she identified herself as a major general. He looked her uniform up and down as if it were a Halloween costume. A general? He scoffed, smirking as if she'd claimed to be a movie star. Her credentials, real, official, undeniable, meant nothing to him. He didn't ask a single question, didn't verify her identity through dispatch, didn't even try to pretend this was about a traffic violation. It was clear to him she wasn't a leader of national security or a decorated war hero. She was just another black woman behind the wheel of a nice car in the wrong place. The air turned sour with the scent of prejudice, and Althea knew she had crossed into a battlefield she hadn't chosen, but would not retreat from. The cuffs click, and so does the truth. The officer's voice was sharp and full of misplaced authority. Turn around, hands behind your back. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. Althea didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply complied, knowing that in this moment, dignity was her shield. Cold steel bit at her wrists as he clamped the handcuffs, tighter than necessary. You're under arrest for providing false identification and resisting a lawful command. He declared loudly, more for the dashcam than for justice. She stood silent, locked in the surreal absurdity of it all. Her years of decorated service, her sacrifices, her stars, they all vanished in this officer's eyes. In his world, uniforms weren't earned, they were costumes. Her calm presence only agitated him further. As he pushed her toward the squad car, Althea's phone slipped silently from her pocket onto the pavement. She glanced at it, not in fear, but with a plan already forming. This was far from over. The officer didn't realize it yet, but the most powerful weapon in the car wasn't on his belt. It was that phone, and the number Althea James knew by heart. A phone, a lifeline, and a strategy. As the squad car door slammed shut behind her, Major General Althea James felt the chill of steel cuffs press into her wrists. The patrolman didn't bother checking her ID again. He was too proud of the arrest he thought he just made. Outside, her phone lay face down on the asphalt, its screen cracked but not broken. Althea caught sight of it through the tinted window. Most people would have panicked, not her. She didn't need access to her contact list. She didn't need a signal check. What she needed was one call, and she knew exactly who to reach. Pick up that phone. She called out to the officer with quiet command. He paused, half amused. Oh, gonna call your mommy, he sneered. Althea's gaze didn't waver. No, she replied, calm as a storm's eye. I'm going to call the Pentagon. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But he turned away, laughing under his breath. He had no idea that within minutes his entire world would shift. The call that echoed through Washington, the patrol car's interior was tight, but Althea adjusted her cuffed wrists enough to tap in a number from memory. No hesitation, no second guessing, just instinct. The line clicked once. No ringtone, operations command. Came a brisk voice. General James, ma'am, what's your status? The operator asked without needing introduction. Unlawfully detained by a local unit, badge 6725. I need immediate escalation, location Route 29 near Fairfax Line, she said, her voice low but lethal. A breathless pause followed, then, yes ma'am, stand by. Within moments, a flurry of encrypted messages was already firing through secure lines. The Pentagon was mobilizing. Althea sat back in her seat, cuffs biting into her wrists, but her spine unshaken. She wasn't just calling for herself, she was calling for everyone who never had the clearance, the rank, or the voice to fight back. The officer hadn't just arrested the wrong person, he had triggered a chain reaction stretching all the way to the heart of national command. And the countdown had begun. The arrival of the Shadow Fleet. The rural calm of Route 29 shattered as the ground began to tremble with the low growl of approaching engines. From over the hill, 3 black SUV appeared in perfect formation, unmarked but unmistakably federal. They moved with purpose, cutting through the morning fog like sharks in open water. The patrol officer turned toward the noise, squinting in confusion. These weren't local backup units. These were serious. Before he could react, doors swung open with precision and men in suits and earpieces stepped out, their pace sharp, their demeanor urgent. One of them flashed a badge so quickly the officer couldn't read the lettering, only the weight it carried. "Where is she?" the lead agent demanded. The officer stumbled, pointing to his cruiser. I pulled her over. She resisted, said she was military, but the agent cut him off. "You just arrested a United States Major General. Do you realize what you've done?" Silence fell. The cop's smirk faded, replaced by pale, growing panic. The cavalry had arrived, and it wasn't here for him. Authority reversed, silence served within seconds. The dynamic flipped like a battlefield ambush. Althea's door was opened by one of the agents, his expression composed but urgent. "General James, we apologize for the delay. You're safe now." The cuffs were removed with respectful speed, her wrists gently checked. She didn't shout, she didn't glare, she simply stepped out with the quiet authority of a seasoned commander reclaiming her ground. The officer who had arrested her tried to speak, maybe to justify, maybe to backpedal, but the agents surrounded him before he could finish a sentence. "Badge 6725, you are being questioned for unlawful detention, abuse of authority, and failure to follow federal identification protocol." One agent snapped. His mouth hung open, disbelief replacing arrogance. Althea stood a few feet away, fixing her collar and adjusting the folds of her jacket. She didn't even look at him. She didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. The man who once stood over her in mockery now stood alone in disgrace. Justice, she knew, didn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wore a star. The moment he realized the truth, the officer's breath hitched as the words "Major General" echoed around him, not from Althea, but from the agents now encircling him. His eyes darted toward her uniform again, as if seeing it for the first time. The crisp rank insignia, the medals, the name tag, everything suddenly registered, too late to matter. I didn't know, he stammered, voice cracking under pressure. But the agents didn't flinch. "You didn't care to know," one of them snapped, holding up her military ID that had been in his cruiser the whole time. The reality hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a wrong arrest. It was a career-ending misjudgment, an abuse of power laced with prejudice. Althea stood quietly behind the agents, arms folded, gaze level. She didn't need to say a word. The expression on his face, crumbling, ashamed, was worth more than any courtroom drama. He hadn't arrested a suspect. He had disrespected a national symbol, and now the nation was watching. Dignity walks away, justice moves in. Althea didn't need revenge. She had already won. With her head high and uniform straight, she stepped into one of the black SUV as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Her presence exuded a calm that only comes from knowing the system, for once, had backed the right side. As the vehicle pulled away, she took one last glance through the tinted glass. The officer was now the one being questioned, cornered by his own ignorance. He wasn't handcuffed, not yet. But the weight of accountability was far heavier. Althea leaned back in her seat, her phone in hand once more, not to call for help, but to send a brief message handled en route to Symposium. Because even after the humiliation, the injustice, the moment of indignity, she still had a job to do. She had a stage to stand on and a story to tell. And when she told it, she wouldn't just be speaking for herself. She'd be speaking for everyone who never got to make that one call. As the SUV pulled away from the scene, and the officer stood frozen in the wreckage of his own arrogance, Major General Althea James didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply adjusted her uniform, checked her notes, and continued on to that very same leadership symposium, arriving not just as a guest speaker, but as living proof of the battle still being fought off the battlefield. The incident on Route 29 would never define her, but it would sharpen her voice, deepen her purpose, and give her one more chapter to teach from. Because even when the stars on her shoulder weren't recognized by the law, her leadership remained unshaken. And so, as she stepped up to the podium that afternoon, her presence commanding, her story freshly carved into truth, she began exactly where she left off that morning, standing tall, wearing her uniform with pride, ready to lead. Just as she always had, far too late.